What is an evolutionary paradox? A paradox is a seemingly contradictory statement that, when explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. The evolution part gets added in when talking about traits and adaptations. An adaptation is a trait that solves a problem. Traits can be anything from morphological features to behaviors. An example would be sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder, often inherited from a person's parents. If only one parent passes the sickle cell gene onto their offspring, the child will have the sickle cell trait. Both parents must pass the gene onto their children for them to have sickle cell anemia. In sickle cell anemia, blood vessels become rigid and sickle-shaped, which makes it harder to carry oxygen to different parts of the body through the blood. Symptoms can include frequent infections, episodes of pain, and delayed growth. Why would evolution allow this disease to persist? Because those with just one copy of the gene from one parent have resistance to malaria. Sickle cell disease occurs more commonly among people whose ancestors lived in areas where malaria was more common. Therefore, sickle cell alleles can be selected for because they solve a problem. In order for natural selection to operate on a trait, that trait must have three factors. The trait must be highly heritable. In other words, variants found in the trait must be due to genetic variants. The trait must be variable across individuals in order for natural selection to have something to select for and against. Finally, the trait must have fitness consequences. Those who do not have the optimal version of the trait lose out on mating opportunities that those with the optimal trait receive. When evolution and paradox meet, you get a trait that is seemingly maladaptive. There are traits that have a severely negative impact on a person's life, yet serve a larger purpose and solve a larger problem that might not be immediately obvious. In order to better understand evolutionary paradoxes, we decided to look at it through the lens of psychopathologies, specifically schizophrenia. Mental illness is pervasive in human society. Regardless of where you go in the world, you will find people with mental illnesses. Oftentimes, these mental illnesses severely impact people's lives, often for the worse. Specifically, in our culture, schizophrenia is often the poster child for bad mental illnesses. Often, the media portrays people with schizophrenia as crazy, dangerous, and hopelessly out of touch. While many of these assumptions are incorrect, schizophrenia is associated with a shorter life history, other health side effects, and occurs too frequently in the population to be due to genetic mutation. In order to be affected by natural selection, schizophrenia has to be heritable, variable, and have fitness consequences. Schizophrenia is extremely heritable, with about 80% of individual differences in risk being due to individual differences in genes. When looking at heritability, many studies look at identical twins who share 100% of their genes. Studies with monozygotic twins show that more than 40% of monozygotic twins of those with schizophrenia also have the mental illness. If both parents have schizophrenia, the risk of the offspring also having it is 50%. Schizophrenia is also variable in its symptoms across individuals, and not everyone has the disease. Finally, schizophrenia is associated with decreased fecundity, so there are fitness consequences. Schizophrenia, therefore, can be seen as a behavioral trait that is acted upon by natural selection. That is where the evolutionary paradox lies. Schizophrenia, in theory, should have been weeded out long ago. This is not the case, however. So if schizophrenia can have such a negative impact on someone's life, why would natural selection allow it to continue to exist in the population? What problem does schizophrenia solve? Before we tackle schizophrenia as an evolutionary paradox, though, we have to understand what schizophrenia is. The symptoms of schizophrenia can be divided into three groups: positive symptoms, negative symptoms, and cognitive symptoms. Positive symptoms of schizophrenia are those symptoms that exist in people who have schizophrenia but don't exist in those who do not. Examples include hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thoughts, speech, and behavior. Hallucinations are false sensory perceptions experienced without real external stimuli. Most common are auditory hallucinations, in which the person hears voices that aren't there. Delusions, on the other hand, are fixed, false beliefs that cannot be corrected by logic. These beliefs are often paranoid in nature, such as believing you're being spied on by the government or that your friends are lying to you. Disordered thoughts, speech, and behavior are characterized by difficulty staying on one topic or degradation of selective attention. When disordered speech is particularly bad, it is called word salad. Here is a clip of Evelyn Sachs, a Yale law professor. She reads the journal she kept while having a psychotic break.
Back inside, I asked my classmates if they were having the same experience of words jumping around our cases as I was. I think someone's infiltrated my copies of the cases I've said. We've got a case to joint. I don't believe in joints, but they do hold your body together.
Let's break down what she is saying. Someone has infiltrated my copy of the cases. I've got a case to joint. I don't believe in joints, but they do hold your body together. This is an example of loose associations. In the case of Evelyn Sachs, she's associating words that don't belong together so that her sentences don't make sense. Law cases become casing a joint or stealing something, and the casing a joint becomes joints in your body. People with schizophrenia often have difficulty with the semantic meaning of words, part of what makes schizophrenia and language deeply entrenched, but we'll return to that later. In a study from 2013, House et al. Determined that the positive symptoms associated with schizophrenia are associated with increased presynaptic dopamine synthesis capacity and release. In other words, people with schizophrenia produce more dopamine than people without schizophrenia, and is not caused by the number of dopamine receptors available.
Negative symptoms, on the other hand, are almost like the opposite of positive symptoms. They differ from positive symptoms in that they essentially take away from a person's experience. Now, these symptoms can include things like social withdrawal, emotional flatness, reduced speaking, extreme apathy, a decreased sense of purpose or goal, and a reduced ability to experience or anticipate pleasure. Negative symptoms can be hard to diagnose because sometimes they are mistaken for symptoms of depression or be chalked up to teenage mood swings, since the onset of schizophrenia can typically begin around the age of 15. Negative symptoms are split into two categories. There are primary or deficit symptoms, and there are secondary or non-deficit symptoms. Primary symptoms are negative symptoms that are directly caused by the onset of schizophrenia. Secondary symptoms, on the other hand, are caused by factors other than schizophrenia itself. It can usually be a result of receiving treatment for schizophrenia, such as side effects for antipsychotic medication, akinesia caused by long-term neuroleptic treatments, or even drug withdrawal. Negative symptoms can be really difficult to treat because it can be hard to tell the difference between primary and secondary symptoms. And since the two are not necessarily exclusive of one another, an individual could have both types of negative symptoms, which could make it all the harder to treat. One of the theories for the mechanisms in the development of negative symptoms is that it is actually a psychosocial defense mechanism for dealing with distress caused by exposure to really overwhelming social and environmental stimuli. It may be an attempt to cope with the psychotic symptoms and cognitive impairment that could come with the onset of schizophrenia. The idea is that the initiation of psychotic symptoms, along with the disruption in the dopamine reward pathways, lead to the onset of negative symptoms. The initial withdrawal provides relief from the overstimulation, which then negatively reinforces the withdrawal, thus causing an individual to get stuck in this maintenance loop for negative symptoms. And eventually, this will lead to a reduction in the pursuit of interests and hobbies, decreased conversation with others, and a lack of response to environmental stimuli or situations that might invoke emotion. And overall, this loop will keep an individual in continued withdrawal.
Schizophrenia has strong effects on cognition. Cognition is understood to mean the act or process of knowing or product of such process as defined by dictionary.com. Thus, cognitive abilities are utilized in world building, knowledge formation, and perception. Schizophrenia's effect on cognition distorts perception, corrupting this process. In essence, the memories, working and referential, are affected by this mental illness. Working memory refers to a manipulation of a memory necessary to a task, whereas reference memory requires a recall of a stored constant memory in relation to a specific scenario or encounter. Schizophrenia's effect on memory makes learning with the illness difficult. Schizophrenia has other cognitive symptoms that affect how an individual interacts with the world. The other symptoms include disorganized thoughts, difficulty concentrating, and difficulty completing tasks. Disorganized thoughts are characterized by clinicians as impairment to verbal behavior. Clinicians differentiate linguistic abnormalities of schizophrenia with neurologically induced natural language disorders, such as dysarrhythmia, based due to cognitive impacts. Schizophrenia differs based on its effects on cognitive abilities and perception. This is believed to be caused by issues with semantic processing and encoding, which propagates distortions in concept comprehension and processing of meaning, thus resulting in loose associations and assignment of meaning to words and favor their delusional states. Due to schizophrenia's strong correlation with language, there is a semantic network hyperactive hypothesis. This hypothesis argues that hyperactivation for the semantic network leads to faster activation of neuronal pathways or greater intensity in activation, leading to more distal concepts being associated with the task. Two researchers, King and Kutis, demonstrated that individuals with higher scores on schizotypal personality questionnaire were more likely to have atypical responses when provided with a prompt. For instance, King and Kutis requested the participants name a fruit. Those who scored higher on the SPQ gave more atypical responses such as cherry, as opposed to the common response apple.
One aspect that makes schizophrenia unique among other psychopathologies is its relationship to language. Auditory hallucinations are one of the most common symptoms of schizophrenia. In a study by Kircher and Thinnell, scientists use fMRI to see regions of activation during auditory hallucinations. It was found that people with schizophrenia experience activation in the left superior and middle temporal lobes during auditory hallucinations. People with schizophrenia also show reduced gray matter in their primary auditory cortex. Additionally, there seems to be a link between the strength of connectivity between Broca's area, which controls language production, to the auditory cortex, and the severity of auditory hallucinations. The poorer connection, the worse the hallucinations. A 2010 study that looked at children with schizophrenia found that those with schizophrenia exhibited different patterns of functional specialization for semantic processing than those in healthy controls. Using fMRI, Borofsky et al. Determined that children with schizophrenia had decreased cortical activity in the left superior temporal gyrus during tasks involved with semantic meaning. These linguistic expressions of behaviors have a neural component. People with schizophrenia and their immediate relatives typically experience dysfunctions in neocortical microcircuits, resulting in increased noise due to failures in separation of relevant and irrelevant stimuli. These conditions are compounded by neurotransmitters such as dopamine, glutamate, and GABA. Dopamine regulates glutamatergic and GABAergic neurons through different pathways, D1 and D2. Postsynaptic D2 stimulation initiates enhanced awareness and focus, which is necessary for producing sensation of salience in response to prediction errors. Conversely, D1 receptor activation stimulates target representation and network stability, which promotes semantic update. For those who lie on the schizophrenic spectrum, however, experience hyperactivation of D2 receptors and hypoactivity of D1 receptors. Furthermore, D1 receptors are largely distributed across the frontocortical region of the brain. Thus, D1 receptor hypoactivity destabilizes semantic network activity, leading to loose associations. This results in modified perception of environmental stimulus.
Now, developing animal models for schizophrenia can be incredibly challenging because there's just so much variation in its causes, in its symptoms, in individual responses to treatment, and in theories regarding its origins. Because of this, most animal models tend to only focus on one symptom of schizophrenia at a time, and this can make it really difficult to create a fully coherent framework. On top of that, many symptoms of schizophrenia cannot be measured directly in animals. For example, how could we ever know if an animal is hallucinating or having delusions? It is generally believed that schizophrenia is a disease that is uniquely human, since there have been no documented cases of schizophrenia occurring in animals. Of course, it could simply be the case that it is too difficult to observe schizophrenic symptoms in non-human animals. However, many symptoms of schizophrenia are also distinctively human in nature, particularly the symptoms associated with language, such as disorganized speech, hearing voices, and language dysfunction. Schizophrenia sometimes bears such a close relationship to language that some people theorize that schizophrenia emerged as a consequence for the evolution of human speech. As language is equally distributed among humans, so is schizophrenia. So far, it appears that humans are the only species on Earth that are capable of language. Therefore, if language is truly the key to the origins of schizophrenia, then perhaps we can say that schizophrenia is indeed uniquely human. Now we will go over a few theories that have been proposed to explain how schizophrenia came to exist and how it continues to persist. These are also sometimes referred to as just-so stories. Just-so stories are narratives that we use to explain certain phenomena, but these narratives are typically unverifiable. This phrase, just-so story, has been used to criticize a lot of proposed evolutionary explanations for adaptive traits due to the unprovable nature of this type of explanation. However, some believe that when the term just-so story is applied to a proposed evolutionary adaptation, it is simply a derogatory term for a hypothesis, because a hypothesis in essence is not fact, but merely a proposed explanation that requires further empirical assessment, and it is a very normal part of science. So the goal here is not to expel these stories from science, but to identify stories that are also good explanations, and then perhaps try to figure out ways to provide empirical evidence afterwards. With schizophrenia being the evolutionary paradox that it is, just-so stories are inevitable in the attempt to investigate its origins. So with evidence seemingly pointing towards an evolutionary connection between schizophrenia and language, here are some just-so stories for how schizophrenia came to be, particularly relating it to human speech. The theory that schizophrenia is a disadvantageous byproduct of the evolution of language began with a British psychiatrist named Tim Crow. Now, Tim Crow believed that the evolution of schizophrenia and language are very intimately involved. His idea is that human language emerged through enhanced cerebral flexibility. Cerebral flexibility, also known as brain plasticity, refers to the brain's ability to change. For humans, this type of change is happening constantly at any age. There are a variety of changes that can occur in the brain, ranging from the shrinking or thickening of gray matter to the strengthening or weakening of neural connections. As our brains change, so do our abilities, and vice versa. For example, every time we learn a new dance step, this can be reflected in the rewiring of neural pathways in our brains. During the course of human evolution, this cerebral flexibility boosted intelligence and eventually resulted in human speech. However, one of the consequences of such plasticity included variations that could have resulted in psychosis and schizophrenia. This is what Crow suggested to have occurred. Crow also argues that the lack of cerebral asymmetry observed in schizophrenia, along with alterations in speech, clearly provides evidence tying the illness to language. Brain asymmetry refers to how certain areas and sides of the brain control certain commands and body parts, and this is the norm for most people. Crow found out, however, that for those with schizophrenia, brain asymmetry is much less pronounced. Additionally, he suggested that the division boundaries between certain areas, particularly the areas concerned with language and thought, are also blurred. Specifically, he is claiming that schizophrenia is the breakdown of the normal left-sided brain specialization for language, and evidence supporting this show that schizophrenics have less left-sided dominance for language. Crow claims that this is why people with schizophrenia might interpret their own inner thoughts to be voices that they can hear, or external thoughts that have been inserted into their heads.
Another popular hypothesis behind the existence is a schizotypal theory. The formation to this hypothesis has roots in work done by Rado in 1953, who classified all individuals who exhibited schizophrenic symptoms under the term schizotype. Rado's symptomology for classification under the category included atypical language and disorganized thoughts. In 1962, Meehill incorporated genetic traits into determining schizotypy. Schizotypy theory postulates that schizotypy is a genetic predisposed trait that can be expressed across a spectrum. When expression is partially there, it is increase in creativity, potential problem-solving skills due to the ability to view the world differently because they are capable of making loose associations. Similar to the King survey, when participants who were asked to name a fruit named a cherry instead of the conventional apple. Hence, there may be evolutionary benefits to novel ideas. For instance, novel ideas can be involved in tool use to increase hunting efficiency. Conversely, the extreme form of schizotypy results in expression of schizophrenia along with its maladaptive symptoms.
The schizotypal theory fits with the sexual selection hypothesis, which suggests that the behavior associated with schizophrenia can be beneficial for individual reproductive, mating, and parental strategies. And this can help to explain why schizophrenia continues to be prevalent. It persists because it is the negative extreme end of the spectrum. So those at this negative extreme end develop schizophrenia, while those at the other end of the spectrum might develop impressive courtship abilities and achieve high reproductive success. One possibility for these courtship abilities could be verbal and artistic creativity, as well as verbal humor. It is certainly not surprising for enhanced verbal abilities to be considered positive schizotypal traits, since not only has language been suggested before by evolutionary psychologists to be a sexually selected fitness indicator, but it is also irrefutably linked with schizophrenia, given its symptoms that bear a relationship with language. Of course, all the theories for the origin of schizophrenia that we have laid out here in this video are exactly that, simply theories. However, despite the lack of a universally accepted theory for why schizophrenia has come to exist, based on the evidence, it seems that we certainly have reason to believe that the human capacity for language and schizophrenia may be evolutionarily connected. There is still much that we do not understand about schizophrenia. Just like sickle cell anemia, schizophrenia has continued to persist despite its seemingly maladaptive symptoms. But as we've explained earlier, sickle cell anemia continues to be selected for because it provides resistance to malaria. Similarly, we can argue here that schizophrenia is part of the spectrum of a trait that has been selected for because this trait can potentially enhance an individual's verbal abilities. It is not an adaptation itself, but it might be the result of one, namely one related to language. Likewise, with the way sickle cell anemia is more common in areas where malaria occurs more frequently, schizophrenia is evenly spread among humans globally because language exists everywhere. Perhaps schizophrenia is simply the price that humans have to pay for language. And if that is the case, then as we mentioned earlier, that would make schizophrenia distinctively human. Although there is still a lot we don't know about this mental illness, it is our hope that with greater understanding of its origins, we can come another step closer to finding better and more effective treatments or even possibly new innovative strategies for prevention.
The truth is, science is often murky and unclear. There will always be confounds, always be variables left untested, and human interference. What makes science so exciting, however, is the idea of coming up with solutions to these problems in order to gain new knowledge. Science is ultimately about understanding the world and our place in it. Sometimes there is no straightforward narrative. Instead, there are many stories, but with scientists who are dedicated to finding out which story might be true.